Dr. Sarah Anderson is an assistant professor in the Department of Critical Care Medicine and adjunct assistant professor with the John Dossiter Health Ethics Center here at the University of Alberta. She completed an NIH-funded postdoc research fellowship and a Science, Master of Science in Health Services Research at the University of Pittsburgh and a bioethics fellowship at the Harvard Medical School Center for Bioethics. Her research focuses on ethical decision-making in critical illness and enhancing patient and family-centered care across the critical care journey. She also serves as the ethics co-chair for the Canadian Critical Care Society. Without further ado, I'll pass it over to you, Sarah. Thank you again for being here.
Thanks so much, Michael. Just want to double check my sound's okay. Everyone can hear me okay?
Sounds perfect.
Perfect. Okay. So I am very excited to talk today about the ethical dimensions of AI-mediated communication in medicine. There we go. So just briefly, my objectives for today are first to explore current and future uses of artificial intelligence, and specifically in patient-clinician communication, to explore some of the ethical and relational implications of AI-driven health communication, and then to consider some of the avenues that might exist for ethical accountability and oversight of AI-driven health communication. And in one of my hats that I wear is as a qualitative researcher. And so I believe very much in this idea of situated knowledge, and in this idea that we all bring different experiences to the work that we do. And so I wanted to start with a bit of a disclaimer around my situated perspective, which is that I am not a content expert in artificial intelligence, and I'm not a computer scientist. I'm a clinician. I consider myself a clinician ethicist and a researcher, health services researcher. So that's the lens that I'm bringing to this topic. And I'm hopeful that there are other people on the call who bring other perspectives to help stimulate a good discussion at the end of this talk. The other thing I just wanted to acknowledge up front is that AI is a very vast topic, and the more you look into all the technical facets and the ethical facets, the more you uncover. And so this is by no means intended to be comprehensive. And this is just meant to focus in on sort of one area of this topic and hopefully just raise some thoughts and questions for consideration and for discussion. Thought I would start with some definitions, particularly for those people like myself who are not sort of as versed in this area. And so the first one is just artificial intelligence itself. What is that? And essentially what we're talking about is the ability of a computer or a computer-controlled robot to perform tasks that are commonly associated with intelligent beings like humans. And there's many different types of artificial intelligence. We can talk about discriminative artificial intelligence that can sort of process large data sets and classify things. We can talk about predictive artificial intelligence that processes large data sets and uses them to sort of predict outcomes based on statistics and probability. And then we have generative artificial intelligence, and that's really what I'm going to be focusing on today. And that is a type of artificial intelligence that uses a number of different deep learning techniques and just like absolutely massive data sets to basically generate new content. And that content can be audio, it can be images, it can be videos, or it can be text. And again, this is just highlighting that, there are different types of AI, and generative AI is where this talk is going to focus. And then within generative AI, again, as I said, there are different types. So specifically, my interest today is in text-based generative AI. And so that's artificial intelligence that uses large language models to understand, generate, and predict new text-based content. And large language models are really cool, actually. They're a type of model that has been trained through these deep learning sort of neural network algorithms to be able to recognize, translate, summarize, and generate vast quantities of written human language and textual data. And the way they work is that based on the way they've been trained on all this data, they predict the probability of the next best word, which is often called a token, when you have sort of an input of existing words. And that's just based on pure statistics, based on how they've been trained. And one of the techniques that can be used as part of developing and training these models is something called natural language processing. And essentially, that's just the use of computational techniques to analyze and understand human language. And so this diagram is just meant to give everyone an idea of like how vast these data sources are that are being used to train these large language models. And so you can see that the size of the inputs have increased over time. And by the time we're getting to ChatGPT-4, which is all the way here on the end, it's being developed by OpenAI, there's, hundreds of billions of parameters that go into training that model. And all of that is textual data that's been largely pulled from the vast repository of human-generated content that exists in places like the internet. Often, well, generally without permission or consent, which is an ethical issue in and of itself. I also think it's kind of helpful to have a context of the time frame that we're looking at when we think about artificial intelligence, and obviously it's really accelerated in the past few years. So, I think the science around this really started to develop in the mid-20th century. It's been progressive over the decades. And then I would say probably in the 2020s is when it's really taken off. And there's lots of different ways that artificial intelligence is being used or being considered to be used in healthcare. And I've just listed some of them here for people's interest. So, there's interest in using this in diagnostics, in genomic medicine, where you have like large amounts of genomic data, personalized medicine, which again goes hand in hand with genomics, public health and predictive modeling. And then these last categories that I've highlighted are ones where text-based generative AI in particular is playing a role. So that includes the dissemination of health information in public health, direct patient care related applications, which I'll talk about in more detail, and then clinician support documentations. And again, like I think, AI has been around for a while, and we've been looking at using discriminative and predictive models of AI for a while, but generative AI has really been a game changer. And ChatGPT was initially released by OpenAI in 2022. And I think that's part of my interest in doing this talk now, is that since that's happened, again, there's just been an explosion of industry and innovation in this space. And in fact, this is actively being used in healthcare currently as we speak. So Epic is, a huge electronic health record company based in the United States that also provided our software for Connect Care here in Alberta. They have, hundreds of new AI features that they're working on. And these are patient-directed programs, clinician-directed programs, administrative programs. It's really like where they're focusing a lot of their effort these days. Another group that's doing this is TELUS, and we know that TELUS Health has been a player in healthcare records and in the health space in Alberta for several years now. So they're really ramping up their AI products. And so, again, when we talk about generative text-based AI and large language models, what are some of the ways that that's being used in healthcare? So these are three that I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about in more detail before kind of exploring some of the broader ethical questions around this space. So first we have ambient artificial intelligence, which again, I'll describe in more detail in the next slide. We have AI-generated patient communication, and that can range from summaries of clinical interactions or consultations for patients and families, portal responses that I'll talk about in more detail, chatbots and virtual assistants, and maybe even things like, you know, surgical consent interactions that are being outsourced to artificial intelligence. And then the last one that I'm going to touch on a bit is this idea of companion digital humans, which are also called virtual embodied conversational agents. So the language around the use of AI and the marketing of AI is also quite interesting, and I'm going to touch on that in more detail as well. So first, ambient intelligence. So essentially, this is a form of artificial intelligence that is aiming to create a digital environment that essentially is sensitive, adaptive, and responsive to the presence of people. And it does that using a number of different human-centric computer interfaces, devices, and technology that can sense all sorts of data, you know, audio data, video data, temperature monitoring, spatial data, and then integrate that to act in certain ways and perform certain functions. So in the healthcare space, these are some of the things that are being developed or being used. So, you know, we can look at, can you have patient monitoring systems that can detect if patients are upset or emotionally distressed using some combination of physiologic markers, audio recording, facial recognition? Can you use that technology to develop robot assistants that can help with nursing tasks in a nursing home or on a hospital ward? Can you develop infection control systems that monitor body temperature, physiologic signs, other indicators of infection, and ultimately create like essentially a smart hospital room that detects everything, integrates it, and basically does whatever you can imagine to support patient care. I'm not going to focus on that type of ambient intelligence, although that's a space where there's a lot of like work going on. I'm going to talk specifically about digital scribe technology. So this is something that's a little more prosaic and is sort of actively being used in a number of different healthcare systems. And so the idea with this is that it's ambient audio intelligence. And so essentially what you have are apps or devices like a bridge shown here that might exist on a doctor's phone and record, you know, a patient interaction. And then from that recording, help generate a clinical note that goes in the chart. And so a bridge, as I mentioned, is one of the for-profit sort of industry developed programs that is doing this. They've partnered with Epic. They're in a number of health systems. And so they claim all sorts of things. They claim that they can record conversations and translate them into clinically useful notes that can pull in data from other aspects of the patient record, from guidelines that exist in the literature, from clinician preferences, what they know of that particular doctor and how they like to document. Furthermore, they say they can also generate a list of problems. We do a lot of problem-based charting in medicine where we sort of say, okay, these are the 3 issues that came out of the consultation, and these are, this is what we're going to do about them. And so they claim they'll be able to do that work for clinicians, and conveniently link it to billing codes, which is, a big deal, particularly in the States. A lot of these platforms were developed initially to help facilitate billing. And they also say, okay, well, we can also pull from the conversation the orders that you might want to put in as a physician, and we'll basically input them into the health record for you. So all you have to do is sign off. So that sounds pretty great. Sounds like it might save a lot of time. And just, topically, we're piloting similar technology here within Alberta Health Services. The difference is this technology is being built and piloted in-house. And my understanding is that it's with data that exists within our health system, and everything is sort of kept private and secure within AHS. And again, the idea is that, our health system's under a lot of strain. Doctors do a lot of documentation, and this may be a way to help improve efficiency and thereby improve the amount of time we can spend with patients and patient care. So we have a bit of data on how clinicians feel about digital scribes. This has been, we're starting to study this as this technology is being rolled out. And so this was just one study that looked at clinician experiences with ambient scribe technology. And what they found is that clinicians really like it because it does improve clinical efficiency. And so their conclusion was that ambient scribing has the potential to decrease the burden of clinical documentation, which is a substantial source of clinician burnout. And of course, we're having trouble with workforce retention, and this could be really beneficial. We have less data on how patients and families and the broader public feel about using this technology in healthcare. This was one survey that I found that was in the New England Journal of Medicine Catalyst, which is not necessarily their peer-reviewed journal, but an online publication. They surveyed patients and found that in general, most of them were comfortable with the idea of using AI technology in this way. And they felt that it either improved the quality of their visits with clinicians or sort of had a neutral effect. That being said, I thought it was interesting to look through some of the reader comments in the New York Times article that I had showed on the prior slide, because I think it highlights maybe some of the other perspectives that might exist if we do more studies with patients and some of the ethical issues that I'm going to get into. So this was what one person said. They said, on an early visit to my urologist, I had a sense he wasn't listening to me. But when I read the notes, I was impressed that they were almost verbatim what I had said. And so when I saw him on my next visit, I offered something of an apology for thinking he wasn't listening. But after reading this article, I just feel duped. I had another person who said, I know I would speak differently when being recorded. I would never make a lighthearted comment or joke or discuss some very private concerns when being recorded by my doctor. So I think that touches on some of the potential ethical issues with this technology. So I think there's a number of things that could be considered ethical issues. And again, I don't claim to be comprehensive, but just to raise some questions for consideration. So, first of all is the idea of accountability. So the onus and the expectation with these systems as they currently exist is that everything is being reviewed by a clinician, and the clinician ultimately is responsible for what goes in the chart and the decisions that are made. But we know that automation bias exists. And so, if you have a busy clinician who's trying to do more and more, do they eventually get to a point where they're not reviewing every note that's generated by the AI scribe in detail and picking up those errors? And if they don't pick up those errors, or if we get to a point where we're relying more on artificial intelligence for this work, to what extent can we hold that program, that software accountable, or the people who create the software? The other issue that comes up with this technology is around the idea of dual documentation and sort of the medical legal risks of that, because in a sense, you're generating 2 to 3 versions of the documentation of that clinical encounter. There's the AI recording, there's the draft transcript that hasn't been reviewed by a clinician, and then there's the final transcript that gets signed off and put in the chart. And so let's say in a court of law, you know, do all 3 count as evidence in a medical legal case? If not, which one takes precedent if there's discrepancies between them? You know, I think another huge issue is the idea of informed consent. So in a very real way, these are still experimental technologies. Most of them are not regulated. And so, you know, to what extent are we disclosing this to patients? Are we asking them for their permission? And to what extent are they able to decline as these technologies get more and more integrated into the system? And I can say that, you know, on the personal side, I've been in healthcare situations where I've seen sort of a disclaimer posted on the wall of a clinic saying, you know, we use this technology for efficiency, you know, let us know if you have objections. But I've never had anyone you know, raise it and actually truly have an informed consent discussion with me around this technology, or tell me what my options might be if I don't want to be recorded. You know, and I think when it comes to informed consent, some of the big questions that patients may ask and that we may, you know, have to answer are things like, where is this data being stored and for how long? Who can access these recordings and the AI generated summaries? You know, will the data that patients provide be used to train future AI models? And is there a way to opt out of that? And as we sort of integrate more and more data that from different sources related to a particular patient, even if it's all de-identified, to, you know, what is the risk that eventually the data gets so detailed that you can re-identify people, right? And what are the implications for that on sort of privacy and confidentiality in the healthcare space? And then I think another interesting question is, are there some interactions that should not be recorded? You know, so things that might be considered particularly sensitive, like issues related to intimate partner violence or illicit substance use or crime. You know, what do we do in those situations? And should there be policies in place ahead of time around what can and can't or should or shouldn't be recorded? But to me, that also raises the broader question of sort of what is the effect of this technology on the clinician-patient relationship? You know, you're kind of introducing this third set of ears into the room. How as a clinician can you predict in a particular interaction with a patient what might come up, right? And what type of sensitive information might be disclosed? And so is this going to lead to censorship on the part of our patients in terms of what they are willing to share? The other interesting aspect of the digital scribe technology is what it does to clinical documentation and maybe beyond that, the practice of medicine more generally. And so this was a really interesting perspective piece that was published in the New England Journal. And Liam McCoy is actually a neurology resident here at the University of Alberta. And I thought this article was incredibly well written. And so they highlighted some additional risks of automating clinical documentation. And so one of the big ones was this idea of reduced quality of information. So, you know, when we write clinical notes as clinicians, part of that process is incorporating our reasoning, the patient's values, and aspects of the clinical context that might not be elsewhere in the chart. And so, and might not be picked up by an audio recording device, right? And so what happens to the richness in the clinical documentation if we stop sort of generating it ourselves? The other issue that comes up is that it in some ways discounts the complex cognitive aspects that are involved in clinical documentation. And so for many clinicians, the art of writing a note involves reflection on the case and involves organizing your thoughts, considering whether there's anything you might have missed, and that's an important process, and that's being discounted in the idea that we can outsource our documentation to artificial intelligence. The other interesting idea is this idea of persuasion, or like a lack of clinical, or a loss of clinical nuance. So for instance, sometimes there's a lot of diagnostic uncertainty or prognostic uncertainty, and that gets captured in the way the clinical note is written in the chart. But artificial intelligence may not capture that uncertainty or that nuance, and may leave notes that seem very definitive and very black and white. And then again, you're losing an opportunity to reflect on, how we're treating patients. And then the last one that I just pulled out from the paper that I thought was interesting was this idea of model collapse. So these models, again, they rely on like vast amounts of data to train them. And this is human-generated content that's provided the value that allows these systems to work in the way they do. And so what happens if over time the clinical records are more and more automated and AI generated, and at some point, if that AI generated content's being used to train future models, does the quality of the model degenerate to a point where it's no longer, as high quality? So the next area of sort of text-based generative AI that I think is interesting from a communication perspective is AI-generated direct patient communication. So this is another article from New York Times that talked about this recently. And what they were talking about was the use of AI-generated physician responses within the Epic chat functionality. So within Epic and a lot of Epic-based systems, patients can directly reach out to their clinician and ask questions. And this is something that I think really took off during COVID when we were doing a lot of remote care. And so it was a way for patients to access their doctors remotely. But over time, that's generated a lot of extra work for clinicians, and it eats up a lot of time. So the idea is maybe we can use artificial intelligence to draft these messages back to patients. So this has been studied as well a little bit, and I think some of this data is interesting too. So this was one study that actually looked at, what do primary care clinicians think of the quality of the messages that are being generated by AI for patients. And what they found is that in general, clinicians thought the AI-generated messages were better. They thought they were more empathetic, they were more detailed. So the communication favored the AI-generated responses. Okay, so I guess that's take of that what you will. But the other interesting thing that they found, oh, and I'm sorry, I'll just go back a second, because the second figure is from a paper that looked at how did patients feel about these AI-generated responses. And again, by and large, patients prefer the AI-generated responses for all the same reasons. But to me, the really interesting part of that paper was they also looked at what did the patients want in terms of a disclosure. And so what they found is that no matter who wrote the message, whether it was a clinician or artificial intelligence, participants were more satisfied with the messages when they were told that they had been written by their clinician. So if you had an artificial intelligence software write the message, but you said this was drafted, this was written by your doctor, patients preferred that. And so again, I think this raises important questions around, what is this technology doing to the patient-physician relationship? And is it capitalizing on existing trust within healthcare, that leads patients to, believe that the information they're getting is better if it's coming from their doctor? And this raises an interesting question around the duty to disclose, right? If we're using artificial intelligence to generate these messages. And so this is from that article, and essentially, there's no regulation on how health systems disclose the use of AI in patient communication. And so it really falls to each health system to decide for themselves how they want to disclose. And so some health systems in the States put a disclosure at the bottom explaining that the message has been generated automatically and reviewed by a physician. And then interestingly, other systems have decided that notifying patients might do more harm than good, and they actually don't tell patients that artificial intelligence is being used to help draft these messages. And so this was just one quote from that article where they said, telling patients that the message had AI content might cheapen the clinical advice, even though it was endorsed by their physicians. And so there was a decision not to disclose. But of course, the downside of that is that, are you in some sense betraying the trust within the physician-patient relationship? And so another expert interviewed in this article said, I thought this was a really powerful quote. When patients send a message about their health, they assume that their doctors will consider their history, treatment preferences, and family dynamics intangibles gleaned from longstanding relationships. And when you read a doctor's note, you read it in the voice of your doctor. And so if a patient were to know that the message was generated by AI, I think they would feel rightly betrayed. And so again, just to highlight that this is one of the many decisions that's being made in the health system around how we're using and disclosing the use of this technology and what are the relational implications of that. The other interesting case of patient-directed AI communication that I came across in literature was the use of large language models to obtain surgical informed consent. And so the idea is that, these models may be able to integrate information about that individual patient's clinical context in a more efficient way than a physician, may be able to better tailor the information and the informed consent to that particular patient in a personalized way, and can generate simulated empathy that may actually be more empathic than a busy clinician in the middle of the night who's trying to get consent for an emergency surgery. And one of the things in the article that they are clear to distinguish between is between the idea of cognitive empathy, which is the ability to sort of identify emotion and respond to it, versus affective empathy, which is really the ability to feel that emotion in a relational way. And of course, artificial intelligence can perhaps generate cognitive empathy, but will never be able to have affective empathy because it's operating a statistical probabilistic model. And so, again, the question raised by this is, what is the point of that empathy in the clinician-patient interaction? And in this paper, they argue, and I personally would also support this argument, that the ethical significance of empathy's authenticity hinges on its moral foundation, which is that it arises from a shared vulnerability and an ethical commitment, right? And so large language models lack this capacity, and so empathy just becomes a functional tool in the interaction. And that this matters not because we're always good at being empathic, but that the potential for this type of reciprocal relational understanding is really central to trust in medicine and medicine as a human profession. And, what are the implications of, again, outsourcing this process, this relational process, to a computer? Um, So again, there are some potential benefits to this patient-oriented AI communication. It can allow the translation of these medical interactions into other languages, which may help with equity and accessibility for people who are hearing impaired or visual impaired. It may allow for the translation of that information in a way that's more easily comprehended. And there is potentially a real benefit to clinical sustainability by improving efficiency and decreasing burnout. Of course, again, some other issues, the risk of hallucinations, and these are echoed through, all different types of generative AI, but this idea that these models do hallucinate, they confabulate, they make up facts and information. The reasoning happens in a black box where we don't really understand or can't be transparent about how decisions are being made. And how are we disclosing the use of this technology? There's also issues around model bias that I'll return to at the end of my talk. And again, the impact on the physician or clinician-patient relationship. And again, this is just another article highlighting the idea that we are moving forward with this technology and it's advancing in what it can do, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the veracity or accuracy of the information that's being generated is improving. And in some ways, it's like this technology wants to be helpful if I'm going to anthropomorphize it, and it has trouble saying, I don't know, right? It has to generate an answer. I think the other big question that came to mind for me when kind of reflecting on the use of this technology and the ways in which it's being promoted to increase efficiency is, are we trying to solve a problem that was caused by corporate tech and the way in which they design things like electronic health records with more tech, right? And so it almost feels a bit like circular logic in that way. That part of the reason clinicians are spending so much time documenting is that there are a lot of inefficiencies in how the systems have been developed. And there's an increasing expectation around the documentation required to support non-clinical outputs like billing or insurance authorizations. And again, this is a lot of it more applicable in the US, but spills over into our use of this technology in Canada. And again, just another quote from a newspaper article where someone said, sometimes it seems medicine has become a gigantic data gathering machine, somewhat aimless and often getting in its own way. And I thought this was kind of an astute observation by a member of the public. And just very briefly, the last form of generative AI that I think is interesting to consider in a relational sense is this idea of digital companions or chatbots. And so these absolutely 100% already exist and are being used. This one is a caregiving companion that was actually developed in Edmonton for caregivers of hospitalized or seriously ill patients. And it does a number of things. It connects people to services, but it also provides supportive listening and interactive, just kind of like emotional validation. This is another one. This is Wobot. Wobot exists to be sort of a digital therapist. And the idea is that instead of seeing a human therapist, you interact with Wobot, and Wobot gives you, sort of cognitive behavioral techniques and strategies to help improve your mental well-being. And then even more sophisticated are these sort of digital human companions. And these are being piloted in places like long-term care facilities or to deal with loneliness and isolation in seniors in the communities. So this is one called Replica. This is, an industry developed, unregulated technology. It's actually intended only for users over 18 years of age. And there's some data that these types of chatbots can really help mitigate loneliness and decrease suicidal ideation. However, they can also cause sort of unhealthy emotional dependence. And in fact, there can be a bit of a conflict of interest because often they're for-profit technologies. And so there's a benefit to the company to have people sort of spend most of their time interacting with these technologies. And just another example of that. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go into this paper, but for anyone who's interested, the Hastings Center had put out an interesting commentary on digital humans and some of the potential ethical issues of their use, particularly to address loneliness in seniors and in care facilities, and what that might do to cheapen or commodify authentic human interaction. All right, and just lastly, maybe in the next 5 minutes or so we leave time for discussion, I just thought I would go through some broader ethical considerations and put them out there for the discussion. So, again, I think it's interesting, what does the broader public think about this? So there was an attempt to survey Canadians that was done in 2021, and they found that people had mixed feelings about whether AI could be developed in an ethical manner, and were skeptical that computers could be programmed to make ethical decisions. Additionally, it was a minority of people that felt that the benefits of AI outweighed its potential negative effects. So there is real, I think, concern or at least some hesitancy amongst the public around how we're rolling out these technologies. And concerns about AI were identified amongst the public when it comes to healthcare. It was number 4 on the list of areas where people had concerns about the implications of this technology. So I think there is a need to respond to those concerns and to engage the public as these technologies are being integrated into healthcare. And I've already touched on this, but I don't want to be, an absolute naysayer. I think there's real potentially for increasing health system sustainability, patient empowerment and agency, and potentially safety and efficacy by harnessing the big data that's being used in these models. But of course, as we've touched on, there's broad issues around accountability and trust, transparency, reliability and bias, privacy, security, and ownership of data. I'm not even really touching on the environmental impacts and the costs of these technologies. And then more broadly speaking, like as we're using them, really asking ourselves and being explicit about whose interests and values are being prioritized. This is a linguist based at the University of Washington, and she published a really interesting paper on what are some of the risks associated even with this idea of anthropomorphizing these technologies, right? And even just calling them artificial intelligence or chatbots, right? She likes to call them probabilistic automation systems, or synthetic text extruders for the large language models, because she worries that when we ascribe human-based qualities to these systems, that leads to misplaced trust and over-reliance. That it can cause us to make these cognitive errors where we think that they have, again, human-like intelligence to be able to move beyond what they're designed for, to consider things like ethics. And again, that if we're considering them to be autonomous, sort of intelligent devices, then what does that mean about the accountability if there are errors? Can we hold these machines account? What does that look like? This is not really something that's been well studied. And she published a book on this topic for anyone who's interested. And again, I think one of the big questions for me is, are these technologies, as they're being used in healthcare, really capitalizing on the existing trust that exists on behalf of the public towards clinicians, towards medicine that's been developed over decades and centuries? And do we risk eroding that trust further beyond all the challenges we're facing these days with misinformation and so forth, by sort of unreflective use of or integration of this technology into healthcare? And again, I think when it comes to regulation, as I mentioned, there's not a lot right now. I think ethics and regulation always tends to trying to catch up with tech and with innovation and with industry. So this was one article that showed that of AI technologies that had been FDA approved, most of them had not been validated at all. Or if they had, they'd not been validated in a high quality way using prospective data or randomized controlled trials. So again, a very unregulated space. There are some principles of best practice that have been put out by Health Canada and the FDA, but they're voluntary. And then broadly within Canada, we have a voluntary code of conduct that companies can sign up for, but there's actually no binding legislation. There was an attempt to pass an Artificial Intelligence and Data Act federally, but unfortunately it died in the House, and it had some flaws, but anyway, it was not passed, and so there's nothing currently that exists. Data privacy and ownership continues to be a huge issue. So the Canadian privacy commissioners are actually investigating ChatGPT for the use of Canadian data to help train its models. So, this is a big concern. Epic has a huge database of patient data that they're pulling from different health systems that use their EHR. And to the best of my knowledge, the health system signs up to share data, but there's no process by which patients provide their consent for their individual data to be part of this, or the ability to retract their data from it. And this is now being linked to the development of the AI technology that's going on in Epic. And we know that, again, when you have these big data sets and there's the ability for profit, that it does put things like data privacy and ownership at risk. And so this was not even the AI space, but just looking at for-profit health clinics in Canada, primary care clinics, and how they had commercialized patient data and monetized it, and that this is something that's actively happening. And again, within Canada, this is happening without patient consent. And along those lines, when we think about data sovereignty and justice, from an Indigenous perspective in Canada, there are, rules and regulations around the ownership, control, access, and possession of First Nations and Indigenous peoples' data. And from what we've seen, that's not being taken into account when in terms of how this data is being used currently. And more broadly, there's the question of, if patient data is being used to train these models that are generating profit for companies, to what extent should patients be compensated for that? And, how would that work? And then I haven't even really touched on bias and discrimination. This video I'm not going to show because we were having some technical issues when I was trying to do it earlier, but I'll just direct people to it for anyone who's interested. This is an academic originally from MIT who has done a lot of work in the sort of health equity, or I would say AI equity space, looking at discrimination against Black faces and facial recognition technology, for instance. And she's also a poet. And so she has this wonderful spoken word poem called AI Ain't I a Woman? And if you go to YouTube, you can watch it. And I think it's a powerful kind of reflection on some of the concerns around bias and discrimination. And so I'm going to stop there. And, I think these were just some questions I was left with at the end of kind of putting this talk together. So I think, there's a real push to integrate and to convince us that artificial intelligence is the future and widespread adoption of these technologies is inevitable. But is that actually the case? Or do we have some agency and choice over how we're using these technologies? They're often being put forth as sort of better than the status quo that exists, but is that always true? Are there alternatives that we can look at to solve some of these problems? Whose values are being prioritized? But then ultimately, I don't know, our health system's in a really tough place. We're strapped for resources, we're strapped for staff. There's a lot of strain on the system. And maybe it's a question of any port in a storm, and these technologies are what we need right now to help support our system in terms of where it's at. And so I will end my talk there, and I hope I've left a bit of time for discussion and questions.